Hey, what's going on, Sean? How you doing?
Not too bad. It's been a long time since we've physically seen each other, but we've seen each other via Zoom twice in the last week, so that's pretty
Yeah,
good.
yeah, we're dealing. We're all dealing, I guess. We're getting through
Exactly.
it. Coming to
Well,
an end, hopefully.
yeah, as we were just talking about, as everybody knows who watches these videos, we chat beforehand. We were just talking about what we think is the time frame for certain things to fully open up and whatnot. So, but that's not what we're here to talk about, and people will figure that out once they find out who you are. So, first, I want to thank you for doing the interview. Very much appreciated. Second, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. If you're a returning subscriber, much appreciated. If you're new to the channel and you like this interview or previous ones, make sure you hit the subscribe button with the bell so that you'll get notified when new episodes are posted, which happens on Thursday mornings. So, for a gentle reminder or introduction, my name is Sean O'Rourke, and when I am not interviewing people for "Did you know that?" question mark, I am a cyber liability consultant for an insurance brokerage firm headquartered in New York City. And Chris, why don't you tell the fine folks who you are and what you do?
Sure. So, Sean, first, thank you for having me on your show. Um, so, two things really about me, maybe three. One, I'm a professor at Rutgers University School of Business, where I teach business ethics. So, most of my time at the university is focused on helping young adults as well as executives understand what it means to make an ethical decision. What is a business that is developed, growing, and providing services that are encapsulated in, responsibility
Mhm.
and proper responsibility. And then outside of that, I have a company called Red Maple Economics. I'm the founder of Red Maple Economics, and in that capacity, I help attorneys who are prosecuting or defending people who got themselves, mostly corporations, who have, for one reason or another, got themselves into a little trouble. I tend to focus predominantly on working against the wrongdoer. So somebody who spends time destroying the environment and not letting people know about it, or somebody who is a constant repeat offender of breaking contracts or
Yeah.
misappropriating intellectual property. So I come at the world from two ways. One, I'm trying to help business executives understand what not to do. But then on the other end, sometimes they're just actors who, for a whole host of reasons, haven't evolved into ethical actors, and there's ramifications to that.
And we're here to talk about both of those elements, maybe not necessarily the ramifications of the bad actors, but we are here to talk about the current state of business leadership, ethics within business, and how those sort of play out across corporations. Because let's be honest, corporations are always the target of politicians, uh, rightly or wrongly. And there's some myths and some truth behind all those attacks to a certain extent. So let's kick it off with this question. Just give us a sense, your take only, obviously, of the current state of corporate leadership. And you can focus small, medium, large, multinational, go wherever you want with that question.
Yeah. So leadership, present state of it. I think in our hyper dramatized media world that we live in, we tend to look at the corporate culture as a bunch of wrongdoers for a whole host of reasons. I think most of those are mythical. Um, I think most of the business people that I have come in contact with are really good actors. I think most of them are strong leaders. But that said, that doesn't mean that there's not outliers. It doesn't mean that we do the right things all the time. That doesn't mean that business people don't have a good intention with a bad outcome. And for a whole host of reasons, we look at the outcome and we don't look at the intentions of the business leaders. So I think many of the business leaders get really bad raps. But at the same time, there are some issues. There are some real issues that we have to look at globally. I think the U.S. is probably one of the countries where our ethics have evolved, where it's sort of standardized as to what's acceptable and what's not. And I think other countries, Brazil, China, India, they're still evolving, right? They're
Right.
they're years behind us. So, when we jump to conclusions that there's bad actors, there's more bad actors in China, well, they're 50 years behind us when it comes to development. Some would argue even maybe 100 years behind us. So, that has to be taken into context. This is a contextual conversation. You can't just say good actor, bad actor. You can't say good leader, bad leader. You have to understand it in the context of where they are in the evolution of ethics, right? We evolve in ethics, and our decision making and our leadership evolves over time.
So, I mean, that is going to lead into a different section that we're going to talk about, because you and I have our prompt questions, and but I'm glad that you brought that up. That it's a contextual question that we try to oversimplify, which is how we do everything. Because if it
Sure.
can't fit in a headline, well, then it's too complicated. We don't want to get into it. So you did say that most of the leaders that you've encountered, business leaders, are good, and that there are outliers. So give us some examples where you can of people that you think are good and people who maybe need some work on that front.
Brilliant. So I'm gonna keep to the U.S. just because
Yeah.
I'm gonna try to keep it contextual to us, because I think that the United States, even from an academic training business leaders, anybody that goes to business school in the 1950s didn't get any, almost had zero education in business ethics. Even going to school for business after the 80s, it's changed, right? So most of these
Right.
business leaders are now getting a view into what is the proper way to make decisions. But let's talk about some of the people that I find to be and making some rather challenging decisions. I think Facebook is up there. I think for, again, a host of reasons, I think Facebook has been moving in the wrong direction. And, this idea of creating businesses knowing that there's echo chambers, right? Understanding that there's division, knowing now after the fact that we're still allowing these types of echo chambers to develop is, in my opinion, probably some of the worst actions we've seen in a very long time. And I think that's for pretty much all social media. I think Amazon, by the way, I think Jeff Bezos on one end, I love the guy. I love what he's doing. I love the idea that he continues to reinvest. He continues to hire more people. But on the other end, he fails to tell the world that he competes against the vendors that are on his platform. And we can talk more about that, but you can't do that. That's unethical in so many respects. I mean, it's non-transparent. I think it's not 100% truthful. We could unpack that. I think any company, Microsoft being another one, I think any of these technology companies that have now moved from a non-lobbying firm to an extreme lobbying firm, and you're probably familiar with this, but in 2020, you have Amazon, you have Facebook that are the top 20 lobbying firms in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And why all of a sudden, these are companies that 20 years ago would argue that lobbying firms and lobbying is awful. What we should be focusing on is invention and new things, and coming up with new ideas and competition. Anytime I see a firm, and this includes Boeing, this includes Lockheed Martin, this includes defense contractors, this includes pharma. I mean, pharma is the number one lobbying industry in the world, right? So why do these firms lobby? They lobby because they're trying to protect themselves in so many respects. They lobby because they know that they're not always doing the most appropriate things in the world. And so they lobby. So any firm that has a large enough budget to lobby, I probably group them into a bucket of bad actors or semi-bad actors.
Well, but that goes back to the term that you used in the first question, which is contextualization. So 20 years ago, contextually, Amazon was in a much different place than it is now. So just like human beings, our needs change as our situations change. So what tends to influence a company that goes from a scrappy startup to a multinational behemoth? And you can take any of the tech firms that you want, any of that you mentioned, including Google and Apple. I mean, Google and Apple might be the prime examples of what you're talking about. But contextually, and again, evolutionary wise, what influences them to all of a sudden become a lobbying arm for themselves in
Yeah,
that vein?
wonderful, wonderful. Protection. So there's you may have heard of him, Jacob. His name's Jacob Bernoulli. He's a statistician, uh, I guess early 19th century statistician, and he proved something that was pretty remarkable, and it's been something on my mind for many, many years. Most people know they're not going to get struck by lightning,
Yeah.
right? Most people know that.
Yeah.
Most people know they're not going to win the lottery, right? But
Damn.
what? You know how many people are frightened to go outside when it's lightning out? Are frightened, like deadly frightened. And the chance of them to getting struck by lightning is something like 100,000 times, or maybe 100 million times greater than you winning the lottery.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen. But people are afraid of downside. People are afraid of risk. And I think when I look at companies like Facebook, Amazon, especially the defense contractors, they're afraid because guess what? They're not innovating enough.
Right.
They're becoming so large that they have to protect their turf. And as soon as you tell me you're going to start protecting your turf and you're not going to innovate and you're not going to compete, you're getting yourself into a really ugly world. And personally, what I would suggest is why not take Facebook? Why not split it into 5 different firms or 10 different firms and allow each one of those firms to compete on their own accord? You know, I don't know if you're familiar. Michael Dell had this model very early in his career. What he did is he said, we're going to create inside of our own firm multi-corporations, and they're going to compete against each other. And that's exactly what they did, because Dell got so large, if you remember, in the late 1990s, early 2000s.
Sure.
Now they ultimately stumbled and for reasons outside of this discussion. But he realized that if you get too big, you're going to stumble and you're going to fall. And it's just a matter of Facebook before they fall. It's a matter of Google before they fall. What they should do is get back to their roots. Get back to innovating. Get back to making new stuff. And stop this notion that you want to regulate platforms on content. Let other people do that. Let other people come up with those inventions. Just keep doing what you've been doing and come up with new ideas and new firms. Anybody that is an acquirer, to the extent that Facebook is, well, they're probably going to start doing really ugly things because there's no competition. You need competition to regulate the marketplace, which includes, Sean, regulating behavior. And I teach this in my business ethics class. When we talk about competition, most often we think about it in economic terms, right? The Adam Smiths of the world, and competition drives efficiency, and all of the wonderful aspects of a competitive market. But what they don't realize is in a competitive market, it also drives people to do the right thing. Because if I have many choices and one guy's environmentally unfriendly, well, I have the choice to go over here. Or somebody's regulating a platform, I have the choice to go over here. And so when we create Facebook and we create Amazons and we allow Google to exist, it really hurts. It really hurts the marketplace. It hurts I guess the leadership. The leadership becomes tainted in that marketplace.
Well, and it's interesting that you brought this up at this time, because I just read an article, because it's the anniversary. This either yesterday or today. We're recording this on March 5th. And I think March 3rd is the anniversary of actually the first cell phone call. I don't know how many decades ago, but it is the anniversary of it. And one of the engineers on the team talked about how the cell phone of today would not exist at this moment, probably be another 10 years out and what have you, if AT&T had not been broken up. And so it kind of speaks to just what you talked about, is that we evolve faster when you're not protecting and you're that scrappy startup. But eventually that scrappy startup can grow up to become a large company. So in that vein, do you think government in the last, let's say 30 years, let's say since 1990, has done right by allowing these companies to constantly buy up competitors and then either integrate their technology or just kill it? Because in my field, technology,
Yeah.
that happens almost on a daily basis.
Yeah, brilliant. I think one of the single greatest failures we have in capitalism in our society today is the failure of the FTC. Federal Trade Commission is the organization that's there to regulate acquisitions. They're there to regulate markets. They're awful. They do nothing, zero. And I'm speaking from somebody not as an academic, but when I was at a media company, we had to go through the FTC to get approval. It was pretty much a stamped. It was a stamped deal, and I could have told you that many of the acquisitions that we did were anti-competitive.
Yeah.
But we put in the paperwork, or our lawyers put in the paperwork. We say the right things. We do the right things. Stamp of approval. Move on. And I think before the 80s, probably since the 70s, I think we've been doing some really incredibly awful things when it comes to capitalism in the United States. I mean, most of our markets are not competitive. Mostly are oligopolistic markets, right? Which means 7, 8 firms. And when there's 7 and 8 firms, what do? They signal each other. I'm going to raise prices, so everybody raises prices. So, although it might look like 7 or 8 firms competing, we know that that's not really true. We know that the whole market's going to move together. We know this specifically in industries such as fast food. McDonald's comes out, says they're going to raise prices. Everybody else raises prices.
Right.
Coca-Cola comes out, they're going to raise prices. Pepsi raises prices. Facebook comes out, says they're going to raise ad prices. Google raises ad prices. So, it's a monopsony. If you're familiar with that term, and the monopsony is they look like they're all different, but they work together.
Right. Yeah. Well, let's go back to a point that you made earlier about where China, India, Brazil, other international countries, from our perspective, are at their point in terms of economic growth and ethics. And while, again, focusing on the companies within the United States, that actually, the globalization has had a great influence on the actions of American companies. And whether it be because you look at Apple's become an amazing story when it comes to outsourcing the manufacturing of their iPhones at Foxconn. But give us a sense of what the influence of those countries and the fact that they've risen in terms of economic power have done to the psychology and the actions of companies inside the US.
Yeah, so there's a lot there to talk about.
It's your show. We can go as long as you want.
There's a lot there, right? So why don't we talk about hot money first, which I refer to as hot money. It has a different context in the intellectual or the international political economy sense, but from my perspective, it's this: when India was given its liberty from England, right? If you go back and you look at India of the 50s and 60s, what did they do? They said, we're going to put all of our eggs in one basket. We're going to put all our eggs in the technology basket. And all of our schools are going to become technology schools. And so they did that. And brilliant idea. But obviously they didn't have the money or the wherewithal to build the next Microsoft. So what did they do? They said, we're going to provide low-cost labor in technology for American firms, Western firms, right? The U.S. was probably, I don't think we were the first to jump on that bandwagon. We were probably the second. You probably found England was already in there, despite the enormous disrespect towards England. England was probably from the Indians' perspective. So what do? You have a bunch of firms out there that now are outsourcing technology and technology related. And I say technology related, not necessarily programming. They didn't start in the programming space. They started in, as you probably remember, the support space, right? Answering telephone calls and taking orders. And what did that do? That then gave them a little bit of money to then double down into technology, and they started to do programming. And that now they're bringing in more trade, and that continues to occur over a period of time. And so what's the United States do? What's the Western countries do? We give India the opportunity to get in the game, right? Now, some people might say, well, what an awful idea that is, right? Especially those that are, protectionists. And I'm not a protectionist. I'm an anti-protectionist, right? So protectionists tend to suggest, well, that wasn't a bad idea because now we allowed India to become a powerhouse, okay? And the same we can say for China. China's a little bit different. They've lagged. I think most would say that they lagged India from an intellectual development cycle, but you're seeing that now. Except that India, obviously, China's got more people. Between India and China, I mean, the number of people that can provide services at low cost is incredible.
Yep.
And so what do we do? Once again, we've allowed China to develop. Russia, Ukraine are probably the most recent adds to that list, because what did we do again? We've used American companies to outsource to these various places, and it gives them the opportunity to grow. Now, why do I bring this up? There's pros and cons to that, right? The pros are we help people come out of poverty. And I hope most people that are watching the show would find that to be a good thing. But on the flip side is you also have governments who perhaps aren't the greatest actors, right? Remember we talked about contextual. These are the same leaders. It's contextual. They're the same leaders who probably haven't evolved enough yet to understand that they got to do something good with that wealth. Russia's probably at the top of the list of bad actors when it comes to hacking and doing some of those things that you're more familiar about than I am. But when I think your question was more or less around the influence that these companies have. I think they all have substantially more influence today than they did before. And I think that could be and probably is a good thing. Because we all have to we have to come to the table. We have to talk.
I was going to ask you that when you say it's a good thing, in what respects is it a good thing? Because then we're going to counter that in what respects is it a bad thing. But from your perspective, why is it a good thing to have them at the table?
You're probably familiar with the McDonald's theory, right? Which is any two countries that have a McDonald's in their country have never gone to war with each other.
I gotta be honest, I've never heard that. That's awesome.
Right? It's I love it, because what it's telling me is if you're in New York, but if I go over to Bensonhurst, if I go over to Washington Heights, and I go into any of the corporations that are over there at any given point in time, I'm going to find an incredible number of Russian and Ukraine programmers who've come here to learn. Why is that important? Because they have embraced, right now, for all the reasons that Russia sort of failed post the fall of socialism or communism. They're coming back, right? They figured it out. It took them a long time. They figured it out. Now they're growing, and they're growing in a capitalist perspective, growing in free markets way. Now, are they doing everything right? Are they doing everything morally correct? Probably not. Just like the United States isn't doing everything perfect. But what's happening with wealth? Wealth is increasing. Poverty is decreasing. I think we would all like to see that globally. I think it's in everyone's best interest, including especially the United States, as the largest proponent of market behavior and democracy / republic in any country out there. I think when we see that the development and the now acceptance of market behavior in China and in Russia and in India and Pakistan and other places, especially in Africa, we should all be jumping for joy. Like this should be a celebration. Now, the problem is that when other people gain power, right, from a political standpoint, it creates friction. And so there's your real international or global political economic problem, is that wealth goes up, poverty goes down, friction increases.
And
You
well,
know,
it's kind of human nature. I mean, when there are more dogs in the arena, everybody's trying to be the alpha or at least maintain their status. So, does that mean all these countries who are on the rise, and let's take America out of it for the moment, but all these countries on the rise, are they going to fall into the exact same pattern to where I can already see it in China, not so much in India, but definitely in China, to where they become protectionists because they're trying to guard their alpha status either in the global economy or at least in their regional economy?
so just because you protect it doesn't mean you're going to last. Um, you know, for all intents and purposes, Microsoft is not the same company it was 20 years ago when it started to protect itself. It lost its cachet, it lost its luster, right? Um, we were extremely protectionist in the 1920s and the 1930s, up until the end of World War II, and then we had what? Then we had an influx of Japanese automobiles, right? The automobile manufacturers in the United States were extremely protectionist. 1940s, 1950s. Japanese comes in here with smaller automobiles, boom, wipes out that industry. They have to reconfigure. So yeah, there's protectionists and probably creates bad, unethical behaviors. Probably takes the company off of its out of its mission, visions, and values statement. Right, takes them off or away from their goals, takes them away from their strategy. I think, and it's just a matter of time before they fail. But from the time they start becoming a protectionist to the time they fail, they can do a lot of awful things in there.
Right.
And that's a cycle. And I think China's going to go through that cycle. Japan went through that cycle. I think you see England went through that cycle probably more times than anyone.
Mm-hmm.
The United States has gone through that cycle. We're going to go through it again, right? In 20 years from now, this idea of Google and Amazon, we know that that's not going to exist. It's going to be something totally different.
Yeah.
So, we go through periods of ugly behavior, unfortunately,
Well,
globally.
yeah, and we'll get back to sort of the negative influence of sort of globalization and the rise of other countries. But I did want to ask you something because you did mention the FTC, and obviously the Democrats now control both the House, the Senate, and the White House. And especially in the Senate, there's been a big push about breaking up the big tech companies. Now, I'm not, to your point, you think it's a good idea to create these smaller companies that it would have to innovate and compete. Do you think that needs to be done? Or do you think technology as a natural evolutionary cycle, these companies will eventually do exactly what happened to Microsoft or IBM or AT&T, though AT&T was broken up. But would it eventually, a new player is going to come into the game, a new flavor is going to come for the next generation, and it's not going to be the same? Or do you think that the government needs to step in and do something now?
Yeah, personally, I think Microsoft's a different animal. Microsoft, if you look at its history prior to losing its sort of monopoly power, it wasn't really a monopoly, but sort of a monopoly. I mean, what did they have going for them? They had an operating system. Everything else that they made was a loser. Right? Everything they made was a loser. They missed the internet, right? Had it not been for them acquiring, they would have lost the internet opportunity. So I don't look at Microsoft the same way I look at Google. Google is way bigger, way stronger, much more influence than Microsoft ever had. The same for Facebook. I mean, what's Facebook's population on that product? It's incredibly large. They have, and we know. I mean, I'm sure you saw the documentary on social media that came out regarding Facebook.
Dilemma.
Yeah, social dilemma.
Yeah.
And if you've read any of that research, it's incredibly awful. I mean, I was just talking to a student yesterday who's working on a research paper on social media use and depression. right? So it's creating divides in politics. It's creating real downstream effects on people.
Mhm.
So, is that what I'm talking about? Why we should break them up? No, but it does go to the argument that they have extreme levels of influence on people. We saw it with the last election, not necessarily this election, or at least we haven't found it to be occurred in this election, which I'm sure there was some manipulation there, but they have the ability to manipulate elections. That that's getting to the foundation of the country.
Yeah.
And so, do I think it should be broken up? Yeah, absolutely. How does that occur? I'm not sure. Does Google need to be broken up? I think Google did something for themselves, and I'm not privy to any insider information, but the fact that they split Google from Alphabet was probably a good thing. And quite frankly, they should do it again. But I don't see anyone breaking up Google, Facebook, in the next 4 to 8 years. It's just not going to happen. These are the major funders of the Democratic National Committee, right?
So
So
you just answered my next question. I said, is that because, as we saw, again, Trump created a unique 4-year period in recent American history. I don't think he's terribly unique in the history of the country, but I mean, he created a unique 4-year period. And that's what I was going to say. I mean, Amazon, Google, Facebook, I mean, the amount of money that they funneled to Democrat candidates, was amazing. And to that end, that was going to be my question. Do you think that buys them time and less pressure from all except Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren?
yeah, I don't see any. I mean, there might be some lip service paid to them that they got to change and modify, but I don't see anything happening to them. You could like Trump, you could hate Trump. It doesn't really matter to me. One thing about the guy that was pretty interesting is he sort of said it like it was. If you have power, he told you, hey, this company has too much power.
Yeah.
Um, if and it's just this is his downfall too, right? He was probably too vocal and he wasn't strategic in his communications, but um, he was very adamant that companies like Google and Facebook that have the ability to dramatically change the way of life in the United States needs to be altered, and I agree with that. And I don't see anything. I don't think see anything changing with those companies in the next 4 years or 8 years.
Yeah, and neither do I. I agree with you on that. But to your point about Trump, it is I agree with you wholeheartedly on the way he sort of communicated and talked about the tech companies having too much power. But it's amazing that his 2016 campaign utilized the power of Twitter to basically run around traditional media. And he talked right to voters. And I
Yeah,
found that a fascinating move that I thought more candidates would have used in this last election cycle, but didn't. And so
yeah.
maybe
It's
it was a
interesting because
one-off for just
yeah,
his personality and his connection with people.
he didn't create that though.
No,
So
no,
if you look at Barack Obama
yep,
was the first one to just
yeah,
just
back in
jump right
'08,
into,
yeah,
and he was. I mean, in all fairness, he was the one that really learned how to use social media to his advantage. Trump just jumped on that train with a different message.
yeah.
Um,
But in Obama's case, he had a team behind him. Trump controlled his own handle and did his communication, and that's
yeah,
that's what I found fascinating. Is
yeah.
he
To,
talked
to
straight
his
to
to
voters?
his to his success, and then ultimately to his demise.
Yeah, yep, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
it built you up and it'll tear you down at the exact same point. So I'm going to reference my questions because,
yeah,
as everybody knows, I always have questions ready, and I want to get to this one because this is an area that you and I had talked about previously, and you mentioned their name, Boeing. Boeing had a massive disaster with the 737 Max.
yeah,
They rolled it out, and then they had two crashes that were attributed to new software and lack of training of pilots when it came to that software. And from all that has been reported in the subsequent years, Boeing knew about these complaints knew about these issues, but did not address them.
Yeah.
And they got the blessing of the FAA, and it turns out the FAA also knew about the issues. From your perspective, again, I don't think you work with Boeing. I don't think you have insider knowledge, but from your perspective, what was the corporate thinking on that front?
Yeah.
Because it boggles my mind that they would go and be that short-sighted.
Let's start with this. Wall Street's a bitch, right? It really is. You got to hit your quarterly numbers.
Yeah.
It creates really bad incentives, and I think most of the people that thought about Wall Street when it started on Wall Street a couple 200 years ago or so, 120 years ago, didn't imagine that quarterly reporting was going to create such disincentives for companies, or such bad incentives for companies, awful incentives. So a company like Boeing, they need to innovate just like everybody else. They need to come up with new stuff. They need to have wars on a regular basis in order to hit their numbers. And so what's going through my mind? Again, I don't have any insider information. I know a little bit about Boeing on the sense that I was against them in a couple of cases, which we don't have to talk about. But they have, they have historically done pretty challenging things. They get in trouble a lot. They also happen to be in the top 20 lobbyists with Facebook and Amazon.
Mm-hmm.
And they have an incredibly large infrastructure of people that have to be paid every month and every quarter, and bonuses that need to be paid. So unfortunately for them, in the short term, they got to be able to hit some numbers in order for that stock price to go up. And my guess is that had something to do with those decisions.
So how do you think they handled the fallout of everything?
All right, so I'll tell you some things about these large companies, which you already know, but for your viewers. My guess is the 737 or 27. I always forget that name.
Max.
It's the 737, and now they also have some 777 problems. So
the engine fire.
Yeah, the most recent.
Yeah.
These are large companies. So in order to launch a new product, there's thousands of different people that are getting involved. And as you can imagine, the communications that are being had, multi-dimensional communications. My guess is everybody is not on the same page when it comes to what I would call a post-op type of review. There's going to probably be cover-up, unintentional cover-up. There might be intentional cover-up. There might be just miscommunication. So it's hard to tell, but it goes again to the situation that we were talking about earlier. Some of these companies get so large that it's hard to manage. Was that the problem here? I would bet you that had something to do with it.
Yeah. I
would bet you incentives to hit numbers, bad communications, bonuses on the line for many people. You put all that together, it creates an ugly mix.
Right. Well, I mean, GE is a shining example of that. After you look at after the Jeffrey Immelt meltdown, and it goes all the way back to Jack Welch. I mean, Jack Welch is hailed as one of the greatest CEOs in American history, and yet you see the accounting shenanigans that started under him because he had such high expectations, and he matched those to Wall Street expectations.
It's funny. It's funny you bring up Jack Welch. 1999, I interviewed at GE, and I had a chance to sit in a room with 100 other MBA students who were also interviewing under Jack Welch. And this is like probably a month before he decided, maybe later than 99, but he decided that he was going to hand the reins over to Immelt.
Yeah.
And I remember him saying in the room, "You miss your numbers twice at GE, you're fired." Mm-hmm. That goes exactly to what I'm talking about.
Right.
You miss your numbers 2 times, you're fired.
Right.
And he spoke about a story of Immelt when Immelt was working for him. I think Immelt may have been running the trains division, maybe. And Immelt missed his numbers twice. when Jack was president. And so they had a dinner together and they talked about it. And I guess he gave him a stern warning. It's like, I like you. I think you could take over the company. But if you miss earnings again, you're fired. And, you don't miss earnings again. I mean, that message from one person who's a leader to another, when it comes to money, right? I'm all for holding people accountable. I think that's really important. But when you say I'm holding you accountable, hitting your numbers, and you're going to be fired, well, people are going to do really awful things under those
Desperate
circumstances.
things. Desperate things.
Yes. And so, is that happening at Boeing? I can't tell you. But does it happen, and in many of these publicly traded companies all the time? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Every day.
Yep. Well, and to that end, I think people don't realize we're talking only every 3 months. You have to hit a number. You're not talking 12 months. You're not talking even 6 months. Every 3 months, you have to hit a particular number. And if you don't, you're gone. I think it's insane pressure. So it leads me to a question that I did not pose to you, but I just want to get your take on it. I understand the benefits of going public, but is a public company a good thing, or is it a disincentive for what we're talking about?
Yeah, brilliant. And there's a lot of literature in the academic circles around this. My take is this: if you can stay private, stay private. If you can do something with a private equity firm, the reality and having the private equity firm sign off on your long-term strategy, you're not always going to be had to 3 month numbers.
Yeah.
You could look at things in 6 months. We could look at things in 2 or 3 years. I was here. I was listening to Elon Musk a couple weeks ago, and his I always forget the name of his space company.
SpaceX.
But SpaceX. But he said, this can't be a publicly traded company because we have absolutely zero idea of when we're going to get to the moon. We have zero idea when we're going to be successful. He thinks he does, right? But he says, if I was a publicly traded company, the value of the company would be zero, and I wouldn't be able to innovate. I wouldn't be able to come up with new ideas. So I think that's really important. If I'm a publicly traded company, what am I going to do? I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to start lobbying to make sure that I can lock in my numbers on a quarterly basis. It all starts to come together, right? It starts to create, sort of crony capitalism.
Right.
And I hate that term, but it does set us up on a path to disaster.
Well, and I want to get back to Bezos because I think Amazon, as a publicly traded company, is a little unique in terms of the way they do things. But I want to ask you, do companies just reflect us as human beings? Or don't we react the exact same way when our job, our livelihood, our standing, whatever is threatened? Don't we become protectionist about ourselves and our surroundings?
Yeah. So you want to get to like existentialism
Sort of.
or
Yeah. I mean,
yeah. Sort
you're
of.
an ethicist in that sense. So, I mean, that does come down to some questions like that.
I think it's brilliant. And that's our first week in business ethics course. What is human nature, right? Because human nature, right. Business reflects human nature. But there is a difference. And we'll cut it up. So you're taking a very Darwinian, Richard Dawkins approach, selfish gene, right? Under conditions of scarcity, we're going to fight it out to the end. Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. That's human nature. It's without question. But are we living in a world of scarcity? Right? I mean, are publicly traded companies really in conditions of scarcity, or are they adopting? And I'll give you you brought up the ethics piece. It's fair game now. But if you bring up like people like Herbert Spencer, who was a believer in Darwinism, he was the first one. Right? He was the very first one to say, at least what we think, the very first one to say, yeah, Darwin over here, he's got this idea that's such a thing called survival of the fittest. This has to apply to capitalism. It should be a zero-sum game, which is totally against everything that we talked about in capitalism prior to that 1854, right? That's when Darwin invented. Right, prior to 1854. So that's interesting to me because up until then, Adam Smith said everybody's got to benefit. The butcher, the baker, right? That whole scenario. If you read the theory of moral sentiments and Adam Smith and really talking about how the market benefits people, or you go back to Pareto, who was the Italian economist who came up with Pareto optimality, shows that markets are supposed to benefit everyone, and if it's not, then it's not working effectively. Um, so does it your question was, do corporations mirror humans? And yeah, probably, but they don't have to.
Right.
That's a construct we created. Right? That's a fake invention, a fake construct. Doesn't really exist. Doesn't have to exist.
So in terms of your, and we'll get back to the questions because there's a couple others I do want to ask you. This is always happens, by the way. I mean, we
Oh, it's
start
good.
talking and
Oh, no
then
problem.
I can go for 2 hours with you easy,
Yeah, it's
and
all right.
whatnot. So when you're teaching your students, how do you teach them to have the moral strength to make a decision that may get them fired?
Yeah. So it's not easy.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't know if I could do it.
and yeah, to be honest, I start the course off telling students pretty straightforward. Being an ethical person might suck sometimes.
Mhm.
Sometimes you got to make really hard decisions that can hurt you personally. It can hurt you emotionally. It can hurt other people emotionally. It can hurt other people financially, but you still got to make the right decision. So we start with the very basics of decision making. Um, we sort of take over where finance stops. So finance talks about capital budgeting, and economics talks about capital budgeting, and then you get these cost benefit analysis you learn in accounting and all that stuff. And what we do is we add to that. And so we'll start with utilitarianism. How do I make a decision on the utilitarianism? Greatest good for the greatest number. Then we'll look at people like Immanuel Kant and Ross and look at duties and why duties matter. Then we'll go to Judeo-Christian, the Bible, the Torah. We'll look at the Quran, and we'll look at how do they define a duty. And then we'll look at Buddha and the Bushido and how do they define a duty. And so my goal in the course is to show students universally what is a good decision and a bad decision, or what is an ethical decision and an unethical decision, and how to argue that your decision is the right one. And they know that sometimes it's really hard, not
Yeah.
easy. But I also let students know that if you come to an ethical dilemma, which is not easy, it's hard. Um, that little thing that's poking at you. Some people call it your conscience. Some people call it, spirit. Some people call it, the little devil on your shoulder, whatever you want to call it. At the end of the day, that little thing's probably going to be right. And if you go against it, if you decide that you're not going to live by that little poke, by all means, go for it, but you're going to feel the consequences later.
Right.
And then we get into neuroscience research, particularly around willpower, and how if you do things wrong repeatedly, you create bad habits, ultimately ruin your life. Right? So I try to scare them into it, but it's truth. If you make a wrong decision once, that's fine. But if you continually make that wrong decision, you just created a habit. It's now sitting up in your brain. The synapses have changed. And it's going to take a lot of time to change that behavior.
Right. Well,
So,
I've always been into the Stoic philosophy, which
yeah,
is not the absence of emotion, but it's the ignoring the unimportant and the stuff that you can't control. And a lot of times, I think we've become too comfortable with the term relativism,
sure we have.
uh,
Sure.
and it's just your decisions and you make it based on, well, what's the relative impact? Yeah, well, it's only going to hurt a few people, but it's going to help a lot of people. So let's go that way. But if the hurt of the few people, like the Boeing decision, kills basically a few hundred people, while you keep a few thousand employed, you've made a relative decision that it costs the lives and the futures of a lot of trees, a lot of branches of the human tree. So I think a lot of people are very comfortable with that, unfortunately. And It
So,
comes back to bite us, basically. Like you said, it comes back to bite you at some point.
so there's a distinction there. If it's okay, I just want to add a distinction. Uh, and unfortunately, I am going to stick up for Boeing here because I just don't know the facts.
Sure.
My,
Yeah.
my guess is that someone at Boeing or a group of people looked at the risks, and I would imagine that no one was expecting the disasters. Um, they probably had a probability that it could occur, maybe 1%, half a percent. I don't know. I'm not privy to the thought process.
Yep.
But the outcome of the decision doesn't necessarily justify the ethics of that decision, right? And this is important for business people to understand. It's the information that was known and knowable at the time that they made the decision. And unless somebody can tell me what that is, I can't tell you if Boeing did the right thing or not. And unfortunately, we live in the media world, as we talked about already.
Yeah.
And the media just jumps right on this, oh, people died. Well, I'm going to bet you there's not one executive at Boeing that wanted one person to die.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely not. You definitely
and-
know that, because
Yeah.
that's the worst thing for an airplane manufacturer.
Yeah. So we have to go back and look at the data.
And neither one of us have had a chance to read the FAA reports and all of that. So
Yeah.
So
So
we're
it's,
outsiders looking in and making a judgment.
yeah, and this goes to the negative media that's on a lot of these executives. There are executives that know going in they're making a bad decision, and they still do it because they want to hit their bonus. Sure, of course there are. But then there's people that make a good decision, or they think it's a good decision, and a bad outcome occurs. That wasn't the intention. So if you enter a decision with goodwill, to use Immanuel Kant's kind of ideas, and has a bad outcome, not your intention, doesn't mean you did something awful. Bad outcome, you feel sorry, you have empathy, you'll learn from that decision, but that doesn't mean it was a bad decision. And I don't know, right? So it comes to Boeing. I just don't have enough information.
Well, I read this book 30 years ago almost, called The Truth Machine. And I've often thought about it because there have been subsequent movies and shows about people not being able to lie or what have you. But I've often thought that's the wrong aspect to test. I want to know people's true intentions. I don't want to know the truth. I want to know your true intention. Because to your point, I think that dictates a lot more than the actual outcome, which can be conceived as the truth. But to your point, you could say all the data says this is the right decision, and then it just doesn't turn out that way. And unfortunately, we just look at the result and then immediately label those people or a person based on that result, as opposed to their intention. So that's what I've often thought about, is if we could have a true intention machine, I think things would be a lot easier. So I'm going to skip going back to Amazon as a public company, because there's two other areas I want to get to you on. One is the phrase income inequality is a big deal and exists not only here, but around the world. But I wanted to ask you, in terms of a cause, I'm not a big fan of if or that kind of questions, but in this case, do you think income inequality, and let me phrase this right, is more a result of corporate governance, or just the natural evolution of technology and where it puts us today?
I think income inequality is a multivariable problem.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
we're not going to solve it here, but I
Yeah.
wanted to get your thoughts on it.
I don't think it's either or. I think those two variables that you discussed, corporate governance and technology, I think they're two of the multivariables. I think the other aspects that, well, I'll address those two questions, by the way, but the other pieces that you got to throw in there too is you can't address income inequality without addressing the political structure. You can't address income inequality without addressing diversity within inside of an organization, a society. I think you have to add on top of that access to education.
Mhm.
right? So there's many variables, but to use your two variables, corporate governance or technology, and I'll look at this in a linear fashion. I think corporate governance was changed first, which had a major impact on technology, and I'll explain. If you look at the rise or the rise in the division between the rich and the poor in the United States. I'm only focusing on the U.S. and we talk about China too.
Yeah.
But the divide between the rich and poor in the United States starts late 70s, early 1980s. And you got to ask yourself, what happened in the early 1980s that dramatically changes wealth inequality between the top 1% and the bottom 25%? It comes down to really one thing, because if you look at just the salaries of CEOs, who typically are in the top 1%, if you look at salaries of the top 1% and the bottom 25%, you don't see the same division as you would if you looked at total income, right? And that's what everybody looks at. Everybody looks at total income. What's in total income? Well, that's my salary. That's the returns on my stocks and bonds.
Yeah.
And that's the enormity of the gifts that are given to us through stock bonus plans and stock options plans, right? So if you look at stock options plans, they came out in the early 80s. And they weren't really adopted until the mid 80s, late 80s. And then, pretty much everyone globally said, what a great idea. Instead of having the CEO who's not compensated based upon success, or instead, prior to stock options, people were bonused and given income, sort of on the success of a company. But you had CEOs that were in jobs for many years, especially in the automotive industry, and they weren't successful. They actually were failing, right? So we said, why don't we tie CEOs, CFOs, directors directly to the income in the stock?
Yep.
Good idea. Sounds great. Without understanding that the repercussions to this.
Yeah.
So as part of this, the stock started to go up. We had CEOs taking these exorbitant levels of risk, and they did this over time, and their incomes went up dramatically. Who else? What other income went up? Well, anybody who had access to 401k plans and had the ability to put money into the 401k plans. People had 403b plans and had the ability to put money into the 403b, and pensions, etc. Right? So all of those, and if you had access to that, your wealth went up commensurate with everybody else's wealth. Well, guess what? The bottom 25% don't have enough income to put money into stock markets, bonds, or not bonds, the stock market, 403b, 401k, and so forth. They're lost. It's gone. Right? Have their incomes risen? I think if I looked at the data correctly, they have a real income rise from the 1980s to now. Obviously, not to the same level as of the wealthy, and that's because they don't have access to stocks. And this is Piketty wrote a major book called Capital, and he explains it in there that in order to have an increase in wealth, you need to have access to stocks and bonds. And without the rise in stock, without having access to stocks and bonds, primarily stock, the chances of you achieving the same level of growth in wealth or same level of growth in income, highly unlikely. So that's a corporate governance thing.
Yeah.
And so I think without that, without having access to the stocks, you don't have access to the increase in wealth. Well, now you're also not going to have access to the technology required to give you the jobs that you need in order to obtain the jobs in the future. So, is it systemic? Sort of, right? I'm not talking about racial or ethnicity systemic problem. This is just basic. This is, in my opinion, this is a poverty problem, not a race or a gender problem.
And to that end, then, and we're going to end it on this because we're almost at an hour. Again, just the United States. Do you think, though, and I'm going to preface this in that just because Jeff Bezos has $133 billion next to his name, that's not how much cash he has sitting in a bank, type of deal. So
Right.
do you think America's wealthiest are doing enough to affect change? Let's take them out of the corporate environment and just say to affect change. Because
What kind of change are we talking about?
Positive change. Take any topic you want: environment, the future of humankind, poverty, education, disease. Because I mean, everybody's got their own bailiwick. Bill and Melinda Gates have the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Musk
Yeah.
is trying to get us to Mars. Bezos has got a $10 billion climate change initiative now. So,
Yeah.
are they doing enough to
Great
affect?
question. Good question. Do you remember? You're as old as me, I think, maybe a couple
Yeah.
years younger. So, you remember Bill Gates in the late 1990s? He was chastised by everybody for not doing anything with his wealth.
Yeah.
He was beat up. I mean, he was beat. He was compared to uh, Rockefeller before Rockefeller decided to build parks and make
Right.
zoos and stuff. But he's not doing anything with his wealth. And then all of a sudden, he realized, he had an epiphany. I now know what I want to do with my money. He came to that realization, and he created the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he's been focusing most of his time in the continent of Africa.
Yep.
Brilliant, right? Great, love it. Not sure if I agree with everything he does, but that's a different conversation.
Sure.
I think Elon Musk is. I'm a big fan. Put it out there.
As a
I think that I don't think he's sitting around doing nothing. I think that guy is totally amped up, motivated for positive change. Anybody that can do what he has done with the electric automobile industry. I mean, I just read an article a couple days ago that something like 75% of our cars in the United States will be electric in the next 10 years. I don't know if that's true or not, but had it not been for him taking the risk, dealing with the media attacks, dealing with shareholder attacks, that would never happen. So is he doing enough? Yeah, he's trying to get you to Mars. He's trying to figure out how to manipulate the brain so we don't have Alzheimer's disease, and that people that are paralyzed have the ability to get up and walk again. I don't know about you, but those are colossal questions to tackle. So I think he's doing more than his fair share, and I think everybody in the United States should be absolutely excited and blessed that we have him here. Be happy about it, right? Bezos, I mean, same thing. I think Bezos is doing a lot. I don't necessarily agree with what Amazon's doing and how they operate. But again, here's a guy who's changed the world. I mean, he changed the world. Again, remember in the 1990s, I remember when Amazon came out and BarnesandNoble.com came out, and everybody says, who's going to buy a pair of shoes over the internet? Who's going to buy a book over the internet? And he says, people will. And he explained it. And he dealt with what, 15 years, 10 years of absolute heartache.
Yep.
To change the world. So is that positive change? I think so. I think it's dramatically positive change. I don't have to leave my house during COVID.
I was just about to say the pandemic sort of proved his model.
Yeah. So brilliant. Those are the two that come to mind. I think, those are probably the two most high profile CEOs we have today. I think probably. I think they're doing a lot. Who else do we have? We have Warren Buffett, who's, a CEO, not an operator really, more of an investor, but nonetheless brilliant. He's doing interesting things with his money. He's putting his money to work. Yeah, I mean, I think who?
Bloomberg.
Yeah,
New York City's former mayor. I mean, he tries to affect social change, immediate social change, as opposed to long term.
Yeah. I mean, I wish these guys. I wish many of these folks that have lots of money would just keep focusing on building wealth for people. Get away from the politics, because it doesn't help you. It does. It's like Bloomberg. I mean, obviously an incredibly smart business person. You, Mr. Bloomberg, can probably do much, much, much more for society by coming up with the next widget and building the next team than you would running for a governor. I mean, that's just my bias, because I think most good happens in the business community. I don't see anything happen. I don't see anything happen, and he just shows you my bias. I see zero coming out of politics. Zero. Actually, I see negative coming out of politics. I see business people doing really good things and politicians trying to ruin it. So I find zero value there, and I don't know why anyone would want to try to make change through politics. Make change through coming up with the next widget, giving person the next job. You want to change you have an issue with changing the divides between black and white incomes. Well, go create a company where we can employ more African American people.
Yep.
Right? Figure out how to create a new school that's not an awful urban school where the kids are getting zero education.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's where I think these smart business people can add more value.
Well, on that note, I'm just going to let people know there will be a part 2, because as you can see that Chris has got his fingers in a whole area of the world that just spans all our lives. And so we could keep talking, but we're not going to do that. We're going to end it there.
Sounds
Chris,
good.
this was fantastic. I greatly appreciate you taking the time to do this.
No, I appreciate you. These are awesome questions. I wish people were engaging with these questions much more and engaging a lot less in political banter.
Maybe we'll inspire somebody who's watching this right now.
All right, brother.
You
Thanks so
never
much.
know. Hey, Chris, I appreciate it. And for everybody who tuned in to Did You Know That? ? I want to thank you again for doing so. If you haven't, subscribe and click the bell. See, there's my finger. I always point to the bell down below. So you'll get notified as new episodes come out on Thursday mornings. Again, for Chris Young, my name is Sean O'Rourke. I want everybody to take care, and we will see you next time. Find the stop button. There we go.